Welcome to the 8th GARS EAC webinar on COVID-19. The session title is Where is Aviation Now? And this is a sequel of the first session in the sense that we have the same set of speakers in this session than we had in the first session. So the speakers are Andrew Charlton from Aviation Advocacy, Ian Douglas, Monash University, from University of New South Wales, Peter Forsyth from Monash University, Xiaowen Fu, Hong Kong Polytechnic University, Brian Pearce from the International Air Transport Association, and Mike Tretheway, InterVISTAS. My name is Achim Czerny. I'm from the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. 5 months actually have passed since we started this COVID-19 series. And the very fact that we can, in inverted commas, continue this series already indicates the severeness of the situation. And that it is not yet over. So where's aviation now and what's the way forward? These issues will be discussed today in this session. I strongly encourage everyone in the audience to ask questions or comment using the chat box. I will read them and communicate them to the panelists. This has been working very well in the past, and I'm looking forward to moderating a very interactive session also today. Brian, a big thank you to you for joining this event. We're extremely grateful for your continuous participation, actually, of this webinar series. It would be great if you could share with us now the details of the current state of the air transport industry. Brian, please, the virtual floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Achim. I don't think I can share my screen. It says the host has disabled screen sharing. Could you enable that, and I'll share the slides. Aha. Okay, I think that's it. Can you see the slides now? Okay. Achim, can you see the slides? Are they on your screen?
Yes.
Good. Okay, thank you. Right. Well, good day, everybody. So since we first started these meetings in April, obviously the whole air transport industry is still in a critical situation, but we still only have around about 30 or 40 airlines who've either failed or are in bankruptcy reorganization. You can see that, I mean, essentially the industry is still, the airline industry is still in life support as a result of government aid and also support from suppliers. There's about 160 billion from government, 20 billion from suppliers as of early September. But this is obviously an issue because the airline sector is far from being a restructured industry fit to survive in the new realities that we're facing today. One of the key challenges, of course, is that international air travel is essentially still not possible, except in a very limited way. And if we look at the border restrictions and travel restrictions as of early September, the map here, the darker, the more restrictive, there are very few areas of lightness where international travel is permitted. We do have some borders that are open, but quarantines are in place. And the problem there is that we know from experience, as you can see here, and also surveys of passengers, that being required to quarantine at your destination or even on your return home is equivalent to a full travel ban. This shows the situation in, well, it was the situation in May in a number of European markets that had borders open but quarantine requirements. Some of these numbers are more than 100% because it includes refunded tickets as well as booked tickets. So consequently, if we look at what's been happening to international travel, the latest sort of full passenger data we have is to July, and you can see by looking at the main international market areas in North Atlantic, Pacific, within Asia, we've pretty much seen no life at all in international travel. They're all at minus 95%, or in the region of minus 95% compared to last year. The one market where we have seen some return to travel has been within Europe. That's been because we have had a more widespread travel bubble or travel corridors being established between neighboring states. We do have some of those being developed in Asia and elsewhere, although in a very restrictive way to permit essential government and business travel mostly. And I guess the question is, can travel bubbles or travel corridors save the industry or save air travel? And I think they're an important starting point, because borders and travel restrictions are still closed to international travel because of the fear of governments from importing COVID-19 cases. So in the absence of a vaccine, or indeed in the absence of widespread and effective testing, travel corridors and access across border for neighboring states where governments have assurance and trust, I think is the way forward. But it's not, I think, the answer, not least because certainly in terms of the revenues that would provide, or that used to provide airlines 2019, it's a small proportion. So the blue segment here are the passenger revenues from markets less than 1,230 kilometers, which is the average market distance in the intra-EU markets where we have had that travel bubble taking place. So these are global numbers. So typically airlines would raise 73%, so almost 3/4 of their passenger revenues from longer haul markets, which are obviously closed. So, to sum up the situation, I think we have an industry that has faced a catastrophic fall in revenues, which looks certainly likely to persist for some time, but with a cost base that a large part of which is fixed. Typically, in a company in that situation, you'd find them in bankruptcy court being reorganized. Clearly, the fact that governments have stepped in providing aid has stopped that process. But I don't think that can be stopped forever. And I think that we really need to see a fairly dramatic reorganization of the industry. And that's not really happened to any great degree as yet. It's not all catastrophic. As you can see, the international travel situation from the blue line, is pretty miserable. But there's much better news for those serving the air cargo market. Cargo volumes have not fallen anywhere near as far. Obviously, cargo is not, for the most part, a vector for the disease, although we have had some cases from frozen food shipments. But obviously, air cargo services are critical for, first of all, distributing medical equipment, and hopefully in the near future, a vaccine, but also sustaining global supply chains, and that's particularly important. Domestic aviation has seen more of a recovery, as you can see there. But if we look at the major domestic markets, here we got China, US, Australia, you can see tremendous variation in the experience. The Chinese market, and we're going to hear a little bit more about China next, I think is it seems to be in a pretty good situation. You know, we have seen a fairly robust recovery. I mean, not the sort of V-shaped recoveries we've seen after previous pandemics, but travel looks as though it's within perhaps, you know, a quarter down on where it was last year. The Chinese airlines reportedly are not far away from break even. So I think the Chinese domestic market, Chinese airlines, obviously, it's a big domestic market that's going to sustain them in a way that for many other airlines that are reliant on international travel, that's not the case. And certainly other domestic markets like the US and indeed the Australian market are in a very different situation with, you know, very much less of a recovery. A lot of that, I think, can be explained by the success or otherwise of the country in controlling the coronavirus. China, we've obviously had some renewed outbreaks, but numbers there are still exceptionally low. The US is sort of past its spike, but that spike was in July and is still very high. Australia, obviously, we've also seen that case. So there's that. I think there's also a pricing element here as well. The Chinese airlines have clearly been pricing to stimulate demand. Average fares down 33% in July compared to falls in low single figures in the US and Australia. But I think what I would emphasize about this, you know, signs that there's a willingness to return to travel on domestic markets is that it's very fragile. And I think we've seen that in the case of the Vietnamese domestic market. The blue line here shows flights rather than passenger kilometers flown, essentially because it's more timely information. We can see what's happened in the most recent weeks. But the point here is that we saw a complete domestic recovery by July in Vietnam. Clearly, you know, people do want to get back on planes. However, a resurgence of COVID cases has sent that market back down to, you know, 65% lower than where it was last year. So, you know, in the absence of a vaccine, you know, I think these recoveries are exceptionally fragile. And I think the other factor to bear in mind is that as a result of what we're seeing happening, first of all, from the health measures that are, you know, certainly unless we see an improvement in procedures, increasing turnaround times, they are leading to lower utilization of seats. You know, that in itself will raise unit costs, and, you know, because of the fixed nature of many airline costs, obviously fewer units of output to spread them over, so unit costs are rising significantly. I think air travel is clearly going to be more expensive. And that's before we sort of take into account other factors like you know, growing environmental pressures. And we did an exercise here looking at, you know, the impact of if the middle seat was required to be empty, and just to get back to break even, we're talking about sort of 50% increases in fares. But airlines are not pricing to reflect those higher costs. Indeed, they're, you know, if we look at the fare data, it's quite volatile because of the narrowness of markets at the moment. But I think it's pretty clear that airlines are pricing to stimulate demand, particularly on those domestic markets, which is where we've seen most of the action. Fares are down, 30% on average across the world. You know, that is not the sort of development which you would expect to turn airlines from burning up cash balances to becoming cash positive. Airlines are still, as they restart operations, burning up cash. I said earlier that cargo is a stronger story, and essentially this is the reason why, from the airline perspective. The grounding of the passenger fleet, which typically carried half of cargo volumes, has meant there's been a severe shortage of capacity for air cargo. You can see from the red line, down 30 or 40% from where we were. Unsurprisingly, that's meant price of shipping goods has gone up sharply, so cargo yields not quite as high as they were in April, where actually they were more than double earlier levels, but in July they were still something like 60% above a year ago. So even though volumes are down 13% or so, revenues are very strong. So for some airlines and for some, I think importantly, some long haul routes, cargo is a really important revenue stream to support the viability. And it may mean that some of the long haul routes that don't have the business passengers that previously would have made them economically viable could be sustained by cargo, or at least for a while are being sustained by cargo. However, this represented in 2019 15% of airline revenues. So even though cargo revenues are strong, it's far from sufficient to offset the, and I don't think it's alarmist language to call a catastrophic fall in passenger revenues. But I think there is an issue, and that's a sort of wider issue, in that I think this situation is likely to persist for a little longer, i.e. the shortage of capacity, because with the developments in the coronavirus, the lack of border openings, the wide-bodied aircraft on long-haul passenger services that would typically carry half of cargo volumes, aren't going to come back very quickly. We've seen some being used for cargo exclusively, but I think that's fairly limited. And as you can see from the freighter utilization numbers, in terms of the hours flown per day, that's already really high. So I think this, the tightness of capacity for cargo is likely to continue. Obviously, there are wider, there's a public interest here because air cargo is critical for supporting global supply chains. And remember that half of international trade today is in components because of the nature of production today, with assembly and production facilities spread across borders. Air cargo provides a critical service here, as well as other issues like transporting vaccines around. So there is an issue here. One of the reasons that cargo is a relative bright spot is that as economies are unlocked, we have seen business confidence across the economies, and this includes both the manufacturing and the service sectors in these economies, has rebounded to pre-crisis levels. There has been that V-shape, the beginning, some of us might have hoped for in the aviation industry. That has happened in the wider economy, in other sectors, certainly in the confidence of businesses. And certainly in the past, these confidence measures have been highly correlated to GDP growth. So that is good news for cargo demand. It's in the past been good news for air travel. But we do think that that linkage has been broken, at least for a few years, because although businesses say that they're pretty confident about prospects of increasing output, we know from surveys and talking to travel buyers, they're not going to travel, and they're not traveling. We are seeing, at the moment, we're seeing some, I think, pent-up demand from leisure and VFR. We are not seeing business travel at the moment. So consequently, this is our expectation for the air travel market globally. So these are global passenger kilometers flown. The blue line is our baseline forecast. The dotted line shows what we were forecasting before the crisis, and the yellow area is sort of the range of scenarios that we've been looking at. We're assuming in the baseline that we do get a vaccine in the second half of 2021, which would clearly make a big difference. Although, as you can see, we still, even in those circumstances, we wouldn't expect to see the pre-crisis expectation for travel markets being regained within, by 2025, because of what now seems to be called scarring of GDP, the loss of GDP, lack of investment, a deterioration of skills because of extended unemployment. And indeed for the air travel market, we would expect to see some reduction in trip frequency, particularly for older groups. For business travel, we do think that in the baseline we've factored in some impact from video conferencing, or at least from companies taking a much firmer stance on travel between offices and to conferences. But as you can see, we think that there's even on that baseline view, we wouldn't expect to see air travel recover 2019 levels until perhaps 2024. And as you can see, if we get a vaccine, or if we don't get it, if we don't get a vaccine, or if we get a vaccine that is not really very effective, which is still quite possible, we could be looking in a much smaller market. I think the bottom line here is that the industry is facing certainly a significant number of years with much smaller travel numbers and much smaller revenues. It really does need to have a major restructuring in this sort of environment. So we looked at whether or not airlines, absent such a dramatic restructuring, would they survive? We've had huge amounts of money from government, 160 billion, another 20 from suppliers. That should have all been in the cash balances of the airlines that reported in the second quarter. These numbers here show the reported balance sheets of individual airlines, and they're fairly representative bunch. It's about 50% of the market here at the end of the second quarter. And what we did, we looked at those cash and the near cash liquid assets. At the rate of cash burn, the rate at which they were reducing cash balances in the second quarter, how many months would they survive? Clearly, there's a group of airlines that have got very substantial cash war chests who could survive a long time. But the median airline has 6 months of cash. And we markets, we think, will get back to 2019 levels by, in 4 years time. I think, the consequence is going to be, we're either going to see a large number of, I think the consequences in any circumstances is we're going to see a lot of restructuring and reorganization, either in the courts under bankruptcy or with government involvement. Obviously, the critical thing, I think, that we need to consider in all of this is not so much the survival or not of airlines and the assets of their investors, but the broader public interest here. I think this is what will drive any reorganization of the industry. It's the importance not for the passenger or indeed even the shipper, but for the broader economy of the connections that air transport provides to support trade, to support gains from trade, and to basically to support the wider economic benefits that we've often discussed in GARS, and maybe a bit controversial, but if we are going to see a reorganization, I think it ought to be based on the wider benefits and the importance as an infrastructure asset air transport is. And I'll hand back there. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is obviously very interesting and informative. One issue that comes to my mind is because this is like a sequel of our April session. since April, what has been the most unexpected development in the aviation, in the air transport industry? What is it that, you know, what would you say is it that sort of surprised you the most?
Well, I suppose perhaps disappointed. I mean, I think what we've seen since, I think in April, we were hoping that the virus would be brought under control much more quickly, or would, you know, would start to disappear in the warmer northern summer months. And clearly that hasn't happened. And I suppose secondly, we've seen governments reacting to essentially close themselves down for fear of importing the virus. And we've seen a very uncoordinated response to this. I think that's been, you know, so the consequence for the industry has been no international travel. And as we saw, that's a sort of critical source of revenue. You know, that's the thing that's been disappointing. Cargo and domestic travel probably proceeding as expected.
I see. There are some questions from the floor. For instance, one is asking, Jürgen Hill is actually asking, you mentioned that airlines need to reorganize your slide. So what do you mean by reorganization? Oh,
I think dramatically shrink. You know, we've got we've got revenues that are, you know, half or less what they have been in the past. We've obviously seen the beginnings of this. You know, governments have, you know, clearly been trying to, you know, preserve employment with wage subsidies, but airlines, you know, I think we've got to face up to the reality that the business just can't carry on in the way that it did before the crisis. You know, we need to start, you know, reallocating resources. And, you know, if airlines are going to be able to survive, if air transport as a whole is going to be able to survive for the next few years, you know, we are not going to see governments supporting companies forever. And we're already seeing support like wage subsidies being withdrawn. So I think, you know, now is the time for us to start thinking about how on earth do we help the industry and the associated industries get into the right sort of shape, which I think is going to be much smaller, at least for the next few years.
Interesting. And then there is another question. You mentioned the strong effect quarantine has on travel, so to say, on the number of flights. So then there is one question from Peter Heubers, and he's asking, so maybe having testing before the flight could help avoiding having a quarantine. So is this maybe a way forward, you know, in order to stimulate traffic?
Yes, I think it is. You know, we know that the cabin environment, the aircraft environment, is one where, you know, there's been very little transmission of disease, and particularly with mask wearing, that limits. If we're able to turn the airport into a sterile environment, you know, a disease-free environment by testing passengers beforehand, then you know, and particularly if there's with a track and trace system at the other end, you know, certainly that's what the airline industry is pushing as a way of avoiding quarantine, but still minimizing the risk of importing COVID. Of course, it won't eliminate it, but you know, I think we're at a stage now where governments and everybody else is having to, you know, balance competing objectives. You know, having the economy and industries closed down causes damages as well as COVID-19.
Would you say that there's another question about, what would you say? Is there anything, can you say whether business or leisure traffic is more affected by or is it just basically everyone is affected dramatically?
Well, interestingly, we have seen premium ticket sales rising at the same pace as economy tickets. And typically you'd think, oh, that means we're getting some business travel. We actually don't think that's the case, because actually the average business class ticket at the moment has fallen to the same level that the average economy ticket was before the crisis. So I think we're seeing people moving up to the front of the cabin because they get more room and more distance between them and other passengers. I think we know from talking to corporate travel buyers and also travel management companies that there's very little. So our last survey of corporate travel buyers, companies said that they would expect their business travel to be 10% of what it would normally be over the next few months. And most of them are saying they're expecting to see permanent changes. Whether that will be the case, only time will tell.
All right, good. Yeah, thank you very much, Brian. There are lots of other questions, but maybe we just move forward with the China part. Brian already mentioned that China sort of stands a little bit out because the domestic market has recovered quite well compared to other places in the world. And Xiaowen, perhaps you can just share with us a little more about this development.
Okay, give me 1 second. Hi, Achim. Can you hear me?
Yes, I
okay,
can hear
good.
you.
Well, I think it's overall, I think it's the Chinese domestic market, mainly probably breaking to two, domestic and the international market. Domestic market so far has been recovering pretty well. I think there are different reports from the top three largest airline, namely China Eastern, China Southern, and Air China. Well, the estimates are different, but I would say it's anywhere between, some saying that right now they are recovering up to 90% of the pre-crisis level. And the estimation is because I think it's in the first week of October, that's going to be the National Day holiday, which is the 1 week holiday, which typically is the peak travel time. If it's some of the optimistic estimation is by that time, the domestic capacity, not revenue or traffic, but the capacity is probably going to come back to the pre-crisis, pre-pandemic level. Well, if it's pessimistic estimate would be probably by next February, which is the Chinese New Year. It's another major peak. Maybe the traffic or the situation will back to normal. But we are saying basically the estimation is either in 1 month or in several months, the capacity and over time, hopefully yield is going to recover to pre-crisis, pre-pandemic level. So that seems to be doing okay. For the cargo side, I think it's same as many other markets. The cargo market has been recovering well. But one anecdotal evidence is, for example, one executive from China Eastern mentioned they converted 16 passenger aircraft to use for cargo freight. But now they already converted about 6 back. I think it's two reasons. One is because of the overall, the capacity has been increasing. So there has been a substantial increase supply of belly space cargo. That's discouraged, for example, or reduce the demand to convert more passenger aircraft for temporary use for air cargo. That is despite actually early this year, the government has provided some incentive subsidy. I think each middle weight aircraft, the Chinese government probably some subsidies up to around 1 million Hong Kong, 1 million RMB. That's about 150,000 US dollar or something for converting the passenger aircraft to the cargo use. I think that gives probably some indication for airlines elsewhere. Because apparently some of the airline, for example, if you look at Korean Air or China Airline in Taiwan, they had got a lot of revenue from their freighters in the first half of the year. And many airlines are temporarily converting the passenger aircraft for air cargo. So I think that is probably a leading factor showing what's going to happen in the cargo market. So overall, I think it's the domestic market has been recovered reasonably well. But as I think Brian mentioned, domestic market can be fragile. For example, several months ago, Beijing had a mini outbreak. Then the aviation market to Beijing almost experienced the same off-the-cliff drop we've seen for Vietnam. So in that case, the domestic market can be a little bit fragile. But so far, that's one of the reasons that the Chinese government has been very, very careful in this pandemic control. And that explains the very, very low level activity in the international market. Because the Chinese regulator introduced a policy called 5-1. 5-1, basically one airline flying to one country, they can keep one destination, and every 1 week, you can only have one flight. That was in the initial very, very restrictive regulation. And they introduced some KPIs. For example, if on that 1 week, one flight, if more than 5 people were tested positive, then that flight, that operation on that flight, on that route, were going to be suspended for 1 week. If more than 10 passengers were tested positive, then that flight were going to be suspended for 1 month. On the other hand, if for 4 weeks there's no passengers tested positive, then the airline may be rewarded to increase 1 more flight per week. But think about this, think about the whole country and one airline flying to one destination with only one flight. That capacity supply is extremely, extremely low. Well, one of the reasons the government gave to such very restrictive regulation is that for example, because you also need to provide quarantine and test to these passengers and also crews. So they need to make sure that the quarantine and test capacity is there. I want to emphasize, even if they have, for example, the 5-1 policy with extremely low capacity, there are still very, very restrictive the testing. So the passengers need to, for example, begin to reporting whether they have encountered, for example, any infected case about 14 days before their flight, right? So you need to keep track. And once they are in China, after all those rigorous tests, once they are in China, you still need to go through quarantine. I think one of the concern is that there are rare cases that the passenger may tested positive after even 14 days. So I think it's therefore the regulator has been extremely careful, because there are 1 or 2 cases that even actually after quarantine, sometimes they do recheck and found the passenger to be positive. So this, the market is recovering. So there are discussions, maybe in the international markets, the 5-1 policy, I mean, this very, very restrictive regulation should be removed. I think people are more or less positive about this, but how and when this is going to happen is still to be seen. I think that if you look at the current international market, there are 2 approaches. One is, if you look at China, basically it's very conservative because they want to protect or sustain the domestic market. On the other side, if you look at, for example, the British is the transport corridor. My opinion is it's really depend on, for example, what's the objective. If you look at Vietnam, if you look at China, or previously, or also Australia, what want to aim for is really to reduce basically the cases into 0. In that case, they want to keep within the travel bubble or within the domestic market. There's basically they're targeting 0 case. Whereas in other markets, probably the objective is to get a better balance between aviation and economy versus the virus spread. So it's like so long as the level of infection rate is reasonably low, then you can carry on the practice. Which way is better? I think it really depends on the overall country's policy, because aviation, after all, plays only a relatively, I would say, my personal judgment, is a minor role in the spread and control of infections. So how this evolve is uncertain. But so far, I would say, to summarize, if you look at the Chinese market, is the domestic market can pick up reasonably quickly in terms of capacity if there's a very good control over the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, there are some news also from the Chinese market, especially the flat rates offered by airlines have been in the news. So you think this is something that other airlines could also adopt?
Sorry, I didn't get quite your question. You mean the airline are using which?
The flat rates. So I mean, there are a lot of the airlines, they have introduced these weekend packages. So where you buy it's like a two-part tariff. So you pay a fixed fee and then you can fly as many times as you wish.
Yes.
And this has been very, as far as I understand, has been really very popular. And
that's right.
Isn't it?
That's right. Basically, I think airlines are hunger for cash. So, for example, two airlines they introduced. Basically, you pay I can't remember 400 or 500 US dollar, sometimes more, depending on the restrictions. Then you can basically fly unlimited in the weekend. So for families, for example, if the husband working in another city or wife working in another city, this is something very, very attractive. But basically, I think the real motivation is airline want to get cash at all costs, and especially when the load factor is very low, right? Because the airline can offer this product if the load factor is low anyway. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very costly. So mind you, actually the government have been trying to reduce the cost for airlines. For example, because of the fuel supply actually is more or less 90% of the fuel supply is controlled by the state-owned company. So they were able to reduce some of the fuel charge, airport charge, and for example, they also reduce the obligation for the aviation development fund, something like the facility fund in North America, or airport charge in North America. So basically, the government have been trying to reduce the cost. Airline has been very aggressive, also trying to reduce the cost. So their cost has been reducing, and you can see their fare are reducing. So, but the capacity is bouncing back, but the yield is not there. So airline are trying very, very hard to cut costs and attract passengers with very, very low fares, or even like, for example, the flat rate, like you pay one rate, you unlimited flight. But even then, the revenue and the yield are still not there. So this is causing a problem. I think I noticed there are some questions about the cargo, and also, for example, the use of aircraft, including A380. One interesting observation is because the government regulation is the 5-1, so you have one flight for one destination, overseas destination. So, for example, China Southern has been using its A380, the largest aircraft possible to serve this overseas destination, because the regulation is by flight. That helps them. Meanwhile, one of the increase in domestic capacity is that airline has some incentive to introduce, for example, a relatively larger aircraft which have no use anyway, which is larger aircraft which previously used for international travel, but because international market is not there, so some airline use a fraction of this wide-body aircraft or large aircraft in domestic market. So like full-service airline, like China Eastern, the report, they have been trying to increase some of the capacities in the hubs, relatively primary hub and secondary hub within China.
All right, good. Thank you very much, Xiaowen. So let's move on with Andrew. I'm sure you have a lot to say about the current situation.
Well, hello everybody. I'm never quite sure what to say. Is it good morning? Is it good afternoon? I know for Mike in Vancouver, it's good middle of the night. Let me just say good after morning to everyone. Yeah, I've got one or two things to say, Achim, it's fair to say. Let me bring this conversation back, if I can, to many of the really interesting things Brian had to say and what we learnt from the IATA figures. And Brian, I really want to thank you for that presentation because I thought it was really interesting. And I also think that what it made clear and what you made clear was that we absolutely need to look at reorganisation. And indeed, I'm not putting words into your mouth. I think they were exactly what you said, and you won't be shocked to learn that I completely agree with you. Although, Brian, I'm sure no one else from IATA is listening, so that secret is safe between us. Let's think about reorganisation. I've got 4 points to make, I think. The first point to make is if we think only about airlines, that's a mistake. If we reorganise, we have to reorganise this entire ecosystem. We can't just let it rest at talking about reorganising airlines. We have to think about what we do with airports, and I know that Michael and Peter have got some comments about airports, so I won't say much more about that other than to say there are a lot of airports, excuse me, a lot of airports bleeding at the moment because, of course, there are no passengers. I think we need to think about the entire network of airports. And more importantly, at some levels, the ANSPs. We are stuck in air traffic control with regulation and with thinking that comes straight out of 1946, and indeed technology that comes straight out of 1946. And we need to look at the ways in which we reorganise end to end. Which brings me to my second point. For reorganisation, we can either look at each airline, and indeed, of course, each airline is looking at itself. Of course, it's looking at itself. Nothing else makes sense. And so either we're going to have to do significant reforming within a solvent situation, or airlines are going to have to think about bankruptcy, either Chapter 11, which is voluntary, or be driven to bankruptcy. And Brian's figures make it clear that that's almost inevitable, I think. And the median airline has 6 months of cash left. Governments have to date been bailing out, seemingly without appreciating that the hole is below the waterline, and there's only so long we can keep bailing. So we need to look at reorganisation. It's bankruptcy or it's consolidation. But first of all, does anyone really think that if all the airlines in the world, or most of the airlines in the world, went into bankruptcy, that one, that's the purpose of the bankruptcy courts, or two, that the bankruptcy courts have got the capacity to handle that sort of workload all of a sudden being thrown on it? Because as much as we think everything in the world starts and stops with aviation, of course, there are lots of other people out there also thinking about those sorts of issues. So if it's not through the bankruptcy process, voluntary or involuntary, it has to be through consolidation. And consolidation is exceptionally difficult in air transport because apparently God wrote the Chicago Convention and we are not allowed to reform it in any way, shape or form. It was originally chiselled onto tablets, the Chicago Convention. I don't know if you know that. And it was only later that it was translated into human talk. So we're not allowed to change it, but I'd like to make a number of really radical suggestions here. First of all, we need to think about the ownership and control restrictions. Yes, I know they're not strictly in the Chicago Convention itself, but they represent part of the Chicago system. We could get rid of the ownership and control restrictions, ladies and gentlemen, with the stroke of an administrative pen. And a country, or dare I suggest the entire European Union, could merely say that it has no intention of entering into air service agreements with countries that don't that continue to insist on designating only airlines substantially owned and effectively controlled by its own nationals, and of course to make sure that no European airline enforces those rules either. We could do it as easily as that. Now, normally, of course, the world would suddenly run around as if the hair was on fire because suddenly the world was about to end, etc. We'd stop aviation in its tracks. Well, aviation is stopped in its tracks. If not now, when? If not now, when? Why don't we make this change? And everyone then says, but the American market will never handle it. The Americans will never go for it. So what? So what? We're at least 2 years away from that being an issue of any concern. And by then, perhaps reality will have dawned, even in the United States. Who's to know? But actually, to come back to my first point and to make my third point on all of this, the only way we can systematically, sensibly, intelligently reform the aviation industry is, and by that I mean the entire aviation industry, not just the airlines, I mean end to end, airports, ANSPs, airlines, all of it, is to reconvene a convention, reconvene a conference. It can be in Chicago if you're a person of ironic historical bend. We can reconvene a convention. We need to sit down and have a new international conference. The court system can't handle the bankruptcies, in my humble opinion. The industry, by making piecemeal airline by airline changes, of course important, of course needs to be done. We need to get rid of a lot of the inefficiencies in this system, but a lot of the inefficiencies stem from the fact that we continue to run on a 1944, it's more than 75 years old, system that was written before the invention of the jet engine. It was written before the invention of the network and the hub and spoke. It was written before the invention of Tupperware as well, incidentally, but I guess that's irrelevant. The important point is we need to have a systematic change. ANSPs are no longer parts of government agency and government departments anymore around much of the world. Airports are increasingly privately owned. We have an industry which, as Brian very rightly pointed out, is fundamental to global economies and fundamental to global growth, and yet we treat it as if it was the last great national industry, the last great national adventure. At the moment, there are no international airlines. There are only national airlines that sometimes fly to other countries. We need to stop that. We need to make aviation an international industry, because that's the only way we will be able to bring the benefits aviation brings to this new world. And for better or worse, this is a new world. So with that, Achim, in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would say, you know, you also mentioned, I think you have the grandfather rights. I mean, this is also a big discussion. It's always about, you know, expanding you know, of course there is no utilization now, so there's a big breach of the use it or lose it share requirement, 80%. So now, and then, you know, you just expand and sort of, you know, in order to have the grandfather rights before the pandemic so that the airlines get them granted also in the future. But then, you know, all this, now a lot of things happening and the industry looks very different. So the question is this, do you think this is like appropriate?
You're referring there, Achim, I assume, to slots and the whole process. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. We are desperately preserving an industry that is never going to exist again. We are desperately trying to go back to we're not even trying to go back to the future. We're not even trying to go back to the way it was. We're trying to go back to the past. It's genuinely bizarre. I can understand why governments, in a fit of panic, thinking we'd have a V-shaped recovery, thinking miraculously that somehow it would rain vaccine within a couple of weeks, decided that we should preserve everything at the status quo level. But the status quo, that's demonstrably no longer sustainable. That's demonstrably over. So we need to get rid of that. But we end up with infrastructure which is snap frozen in the 1970s. All the infrastructure, and yes, absolutely that includes slots. It absolutely includes ATM and the way in which we control flights. Why on God's good earth we feel the need to control slots by way of sectors as opposed to by way of trajectories or missions is beyond my ken. We continue to price ATM as if it was all, by running it as a sector, the moment we have, if it costs €100 to operate that sector, if there's 100 aeroplanes go through that sector, we charge them €1 each. If one aeroplane goes through that sector, we charge it €100. It's a genuinely crazy system. And slots, to come back finally to your point, Achim, slots are a classic example of that. We have now snap frozen the industry as if it still had A380s, as if it still had 747s, as if it still had international aviation. Once you take a view that the slot system needs to be preserved, and then you look at Brian's charts, we've basically said we'll not allow competition into the air transport industry until at least 2024. That is a bizarre outcome. That is a genuinely bizarre outcome. So to come to the question Ben's asked, why are we spending all this money on bailing out instead of spending all this money on actual reform? I wish I knew, Ben. I really wish I knew. I think it's because originally everybody panicked, their hair was on fire. And of course, individual airlines are worried about themselves. That's exactly correct. And individual airlines went and spoke to the regulators. And you must understand that to talk to aviation regulators, you have to go to Stockholm, right? Because aviation regulation is a classic example of the Stockholm syndrome, where the regulators for air transport genuinely believe in air transport. Of course they do, that's fair enough, that goes without saying. But we need a broader picture. We need to pull back, we need to look at what's going on globally, and we need to look at what's going on almost universally, dare I say, and take a look at how we can reform the entire system. And yes, that includes slots.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, and closely related to the slot issue is definitely is the issue of the traffic riots, Ian.
Oh, indeed.
It seems like a good time for a regulator to start talking to you.
Yes.
So I very rarely disagree with Andrew, and I'm not going to disagree with him now. I think if I reflected on, as you asked, what was different from the last time we spoke, I think Brian's excellent presentation summed it up. And it's a fading hope that this will all go away quickly and life would go back to normal. And I think that's where Andrew was just talking as well, that there is this degree of desperation. I was talking to someone from one of the carriers in this part of the world the last few days, and they're still being asked by people to file schedules that they know won't be flown. So give us your next seasonal schedule and then tell us that you won't be flying it. The current time, the Australian government has an absolute prohibition on us leaving the country. For emergencies, you can apply. Approved something, I think, like 10% of the applications for departures from Australia. So international travel is effectively locked down here. Even for Australians abroad wanting to come back, it's limited to around 4,000 or 4,500 a week, which has left, I think, still 25,000 Australians who are desperate to get home, stranded, sitting in other parts of the world, and aircraft coming in have a passenger number cap on them as well. On top of that, we have not only the international border closed by the federal government, but internally, the state borders are largely closed by the state governments, which is why Brian's presentation showed domestic travel had not recovered inside Australia. In fact, the busiest sector at the moment is inside the state of Queensland from Brisbane to Cairns. And it's causing a lot of discussion. Qantas, Virgin, a number of the travel operators are actually pressing very hard at the moment to have some intervention to start to reopen the borders and to give you some idea of the extent of that shutdown. I cannot go to any other place in Australia without 14 days quarantine from Sydney. The case count in Sydney today was 7. 4 of which I think were in hotel quarantine as returned international travellers. We have not had a double-digit case count in Sydney with an average of 20,000 tests a day, at least 2 weeks now, yet the state borders are completely locked. So we are in an environment where we've gone from aviation rules being designed in an environment where we wanted to fly and wanted to encourage flying, to rules being made now which say we don't want anybody moving anywhere. And certainly in the domestic Australian case, even where the infection rates are extremely low. In the state of Victoria, particularly the city of Melbourne, has had an outbreak. It's now back into, I think there were 41 cases today. They've been very, Peter will tell you when he's on, I'm sure, very tightly locked down. But we're at the situation now in Australia where we are under 50 cases a day across the entire country, with every state border locked down and international travel at a complete standstill. So it is going to be a very long slog out for the carriers in this part of the world. And then we face some of the regulatory questions. The act which I'm required to implement and to follow at the International Air Services Commission says if carriers don't use the traffic rights, they lose them. And we are not the only jurisdiction that has that. The Malaysians have one which is much stricter. They don't even get to have a discussion about it. They automatically forfeit the traffic rights after 6 months. But for us, we are looking a bit like the slot question at traffic rights that have been allocated to Qantas and to Virgin and to some smaller carriers who are prohibited effectively from using them by the federal government, but we're sitting there with a piece of legislation that says if they're not using them, they're supposed to hand them back. So, Andrew, maybe we in fact are forced into addressing a restructure of some of the aviation environment in Australia simply because the legislation will push us into a corner and we will have to sit down and have that discussion. Unfortunately, we can't have that discussion internationally, and it does risk leaving the Australian carriers at a bit of a disadvantage to some of their international competitors. And I think there have been a couple of questions about, why don't we do this on an industry basis? Why does everybody do it locally? Everyone does it locally because they're either looking out for or obliged by legislation to deal only with their local carrier. I guess my concerns with much of this are that a lot of the decision making has really been very binary. Markets are open, markets are closed. Quarantine is 14 days, quarantine is 0. Testing is, everybody, or testing is nobody. There hasn't been, that I've seen anyway, a really smart approach to some of this more broadly that says, someone who is a returning expat business person coming from Singapore or Taiwan to Australia arguably is a much lower risk passenger than a backpacker coming from Brazil. But I don't see that subtlety being presented to us in any of the border regimes or the testing regimes. That's probably a good mouthful for me to start the discussion running.
Wait a second. Can I just, because I just remember what Xiaowen mentioned about China, and they were saying, oh, if we find so and so many cases on this flight, then we kind of cut it down for 1 week. If it's double digit, then we cut it down for 1 month. This seems like a relatively flexible approach. Do you think this could be helping?
Yeah, that might be a way of doing it. I mean, part of the difficulty doing that in Australia is that or a good chunk of the capacity coming in at the moment is on carriers like Emirates or particularly Qatar, who are coming through a hub. So what you're getting is an aggregation of hub passengers in Doha or Dubai coming into gateways in Australia. So maybe that makes it even a little more difficult to try to track down where, do you shut down the original source, or do you say to Qatar, you can't come at all because a passenger that came through your hub was infected. I have to say as well, the rates that are turning up in hotel quarantine are relatively low. And I'm not sure what the experience is in other places, but there are 2,500 people a week coming into New South Wales hotel quarantine for 2 weeks. So there are 5,000 people roughly in the hotels here. And out of that, we're getting case numbers 3, 4, 5, 6 a day. So it's not as if there has been a large swamping of the country with cases coming in, even where they are returning travellers who are entitled to travel in, and we're quarantining them on arrival. So I just have a sense that there has to be a better way of triaging the risk and understanding perhaps an algorithm that says, a Brazilian backpacker is 100, an expat businessman coming from Taipei who's been there for 2 weeks, where there are effectively 0 cases, is 5. And that we then judge the way we treat the risk after that. Happy to take some questions if there are some there.
Yeah, I would say let's move on with Mike, because I know that Mike also has something to say about consolidation and maybe also about airports. But I guess maybe the consolidation part, maybe the more relevant one at this stage, at the moment. But it's up to you.
Yeah,
So,
no, very happy
okay.
to do that.
So can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear
Okay,
you.
good. So I have a few comments, but I'll try and keep them short. So first on the issue of airline consolidation, Andrew raised the issue of foreign ownership reform and gave us some ideas on ways that we might do that. Not relevant in the Trump United States, but perhaps the rest of the world can embrace it. But there's another dimension to, another impediment to consolidation, and that's competition law. So while we're in the pandemic, we actually have competition authorities that are looking at attempted airline mergers and acquisitions as if there had been no pandemic. So a specific case that I've been dealing with is Air Canada is attempting to acquire a dramatically smaller airline called Air Transat. Transat is a leisure destination airline with no feed. Air Canada has feed, and Transat's aircraft are only utilized about 6 hours a day. This is before COVID. And so Air Canada saw an opportunity. But after almost 2 years of evaluation, not only is Canada still continuing its evaluation, but now the European Commission decided they want to look at a Canadian airline merger. And so we have to rethink the application of competition law in the airline industry. And we can talk about that, for days on end. But in some countries, competition law is an entity unto itself, whereas in others, the United States would be an example. Decisions, New Zealand would be another. Decisions about airline mergers, other than domestic, if it involves anybody with a international service, they're actually not made on a pure competition basis. They're made on a public interest basis, typically by the minister, or in the United States case, the Secretary of Transportation. I wanted to secondly make some comments about why we need air transport. I think it's important for us to review that from time to time. And first of all, ACI World has got a new publication out about recovery from COVID. And one of the things they did that I really liked is they reminded people that the United Nations in 2015 established the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 15 of them. And in fact, 13 of those require air transport, or transport's going to play a role. And I won't go through the details unless questions come up, but we likely won't have time. But it's really important to recognize that air transport does play a critical role in not only the global economy, but global social connectivity, medical connectivity, so forth. A second example is there's a brand new study coming out of Harvard University, not from economics group, but more of a psychometrics group. And what they're trying to do is actually figure out what role does business air travel play in economic activity. And even I was surprised by the results that they got. And they basically say that the business travel network actually predicts better than any other single variable which economic activities are going to grow in a country and which economic activities are going to contract. And so it leads me to view that in spite of the wonders of Zoom and Teams and WebEx and so forth, there will be a need for business air travel to return. I think we can coast for a while on existing connections like we have, that's putting together this conference. But over time, you need to add people, and a lot of the purposes of conferences is simply personal networking. And I think that air travel, business travel, will be important on that. Now, the last thing is I just want to comment about a few things about what's happening in the airport world. Brian gave, as always, a wonderful presentation on the airline world. In the airport world, there are a few key observations. Some work that was just published by ACI if you go through the detail, it actually indicates that fixed costs in the airport sector are about 67%, 2/3 of total costs. A lot of people think of it. I've heard some like Tayum say it's 25%. Well, actually, sometimes he says it's 0, but others say 50. But the ACI work suggests it's 2/3. And so we've got a challenge right now where the airports thus far have had like the airlines, a dramatic loss in revenues. Revenues are down 57%, but they've only been able to shed about 28% of their cost. Another number they've got is a lot of industries will use a debt to EBITDA ratio, and that's normally in the airport sector around 4 to 5. But that's actually, their projections are that's going to go up to 10. And at 10, it's unlikely the financial sector is going to be willing to finance airports. We are already seeing a number of airports losing several points in their bond ratings, as is also the case in the airline sector. Another observation in the airport sector is that we are seeing not only the loss of aeronautical revenue, but the non-aeronautical revenue is being lost as well. And some of that is high profit revenue. And so that means that not only will airports need to raise fees at some point because of the loss of traffic in terms of covering the aeronautical costs, but the offset to aeronautical costs that we've relied on, about 40% offset from non-aeronautical revenues, that's starting to disappear in a fairly major way, which will require even further increases in airport charges. I think Peter's going to have some comments about ways to get out of this. For the small airports, there is a real crisis. Some of these airports seem unlikely to get through. And in terms of, I think Peter's going to talk about some regulatory solutions, but there are some economic solutions. One things we're seeing in Thailand right now is the building of airport networks. So Malaysia, all the airports, all but one, are operated by Malaysian airports. So it's a network operator. There's a number of network operators and airport network operators in the world. In Thailand, the 2 big airports and a few others have been a network, a very small network, but they're now adding many of the smaller airports into their networks. And that's a means by keeping them alive. Now, some economists will say, well, that's a problem because that involves cross-subsidy. But I don't think the economics would support that, because the key economic production unit is a route, and a route has got airports at both ends. And so the cost of operating the route from an airline point of view is going to depend on what the charges you're going to face. And it may be that you've got inelastic demand at the small airport end of a route, and elastic demand at the small airport end, and inelastic demand on the large airport. And I don't think we as economists have fully thought out the pricing policies when you're actually selling, when things are coming in fixed proportions, a small airport and the hub airport together at the same time. Like Brian indicated, there's going to be a need for restructuring in the airline industry. Well, the same is going to have to happen in the airport sector. And Andrew made some good comments about we have to address the whole ecosystem. One approach is to adjust the values or the liability side, I should say, in equity of the airport sector. So their values have fallen because their assets are valued at what the present value is of the revenues they can earn, and that's dropped. And so a number of airports right now are moving toward filing for bankruptcy. And there's the first step usually is attempting to renegotiate with your lenders new terms for your debt. And that is taking place right now. And where those airports are not going to be, for those airports that are not going to be successful in renegotiating the debt, then the next step will be coming to adjust the equity which means bankruptcy is a way out unless you do something like network operations. We are at InterVISTAS aware of many airports now have abruptly canceled their capital programs completely, even incurring substantial multi-$100 million costs of terminating their capital program. Bond ratings, as I indicated, are falling. Some, though, however, are considering changes to their governance model, which is something that Andrew's talked about in his weekly and monthly newsletters, but didn't have a chance to address today. I think I'll just stop here in the interest of time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I still want to ask you one question. So the airports say that the airline, that the airport charges mount up to around 5% of the airline costs.
No,
so what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the route in the particular airports. If there's a U.S. airport involved on a route because of the heavy subsidies to the U.S. airports through municipal bond financing, it reduces their cost of debt by 40%. And the airport improvement subsidies, 5% is probably right. But for most other airports in the world, I think the right number in terms of the airport charges on average is 1% of the all-in ticket prices. Probably 8 to 12%, somewhere in that range. IATA's got some higher numbers, but we'll debate that in another forum.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mike. So let's move to Peter. The reason why I'm mentioning this percentage, the 5% that airport charges mean to airline costs or contribute to airline costs, is because what airports kind of highlight in this environment is the user pay principle, and they basically say, well, we have our costs; they're largely fixed. So now and passengers are supposed to cover our costs, and that could mean that with lower passengers, then the airport charges should go up. So, what are your thoughts on this, Peter?
Right. Thanks very much. Now you can hear me, can you? I seem to.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I seem to have lost myself. Here we are. Now, what I'd like to do is just talk about 3 sorts of airports, and the first. In fact, Mike has already talked about the third one that I was going to talk about, and those are small and perhaps marginal airports. And so I'll just leave that aside. And so I'll talk about 2 types of airports which have rather different circumstances. The first of all is the medium to large airports which have market power. And of course, those airports may well be regulated or they may be public. And the other second one was the competitive airport, and they could be public or private, etc., and they are less likely to be regulated. So let's look at those 2. Now, first of all, looking at the airports with market power, overall, they should not be in a difficult position. Now, that's not to say that they might not be that way, but nonetheless, that shouldn't be the case. They shouldn't have a problem of viability in the longer run. At least, that shouldn't be that way. Now, of course, they will have a problem of liquidity in the short run. And that's true however big or small the airport might be. So one option is that there might be government assistance. So that's one possibility. The other option, of course, is that the airports can raise funds. Now that, of course, then comes into the question, at what price? And Mike has already mentioned that ratings agencies are beginning to say, well, we're worried about these investments. Now, I think that one thing that needs to be really established very clearly is that airports in these circumstances, with quite a lot of market power, are really excellent investments. And so, you know, the rating agencies and suppliers of finance really should take that one into account. And I'm not even sure that they really do take that into account fully. So when you're thinking about rating agencies, they should recognize how good these investments are. And then that means that they can survive a period of zero profits or negative profits, as long as they're able to recoup those profits, sorry, those losses in the medium term and later long term. So we have to recognize that these airports don't need to put up their charges immediately. Now, that may be the case with regulators. They will say, oh, well, you'll have to cover your costs every year. But that's just an arbitrary rule. Now, as it turns out, some airports around the world are beginning to put up prices unnecessarily, in my view. So that this is one thing that I think we need to think about in terms of these either government airports or regulated airports. We should be suggesting that these airports cover their costs in the longer term, but not necessarily the short term. And indeed, that's recognised by some of the airports, and some are actually talking about, or perhaps actually doing, things such as deferring charges to the airports and the airlines, and this would be very helpful. So airports with market power, not a fundamental problem. On the other hand, if you've got airports facing competition, then that's a real problem there. There are potentially real problems there. These airports have liquidity problems like the others, but they also they're not able to just raise their charges at will, even in the medium to long run, because they're facing up against competition. And indeed, these airports are really looking like airlines rather than the other airports. These are companies which are facing strong competition potentially and making it very difficult. They lose revenues and profits now, but they can't make it up later on. So there is a real problem there. And so the sorts of things that Mike has discussed in the case of very small airports and so on is also quite relevant in the perhaps larger and perhaps even quite large airports which are facing competition. So that there is a case for government assistance, and there are also, especially since the travel bans, which we've been talking about, actually create a benefit for the whole community, but are government imposed and negatively affect the airports. Final observation, one thing that we were going to talk about, which we haven't just yet, so just a quick discussion. Who should pay for the extra health-related costs of airports and indeed airlines? As we know, airlines and airports are facing increasing costs to ensure safe travel. The airports have got cash costs, but they also got very big infrastructure costs, more space needed in the terminals. And so when asked, you know, who's causing these costs to be incurred? Well, fundamentally, it's the virus. So it may be that the government is mandating standards, Or it even might be that the airport itself is choosing to operate in a more safe way. But so there's a question then of who should be paying. Well, I guess perhaps it's a good, there is a case, at least for the immediate future, that these problem prices, costs might be covered by the government. But in the longer run, probably it'll be the passenger. And that, of course, what happens with safety features in aircraft. It happens with security. Ultimately, it's the passenger that pays. And I think that in the longer run, i.e. in the next 3 or 4 years and after, as long as things are going well, it'll be the passengers that either officially pay or at least actually pay, even though it may be covered up in different ways. I don't think the government will be paying for these sorts of costs in the long term. Okay, so I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have 4 minutes left. So I remember the last session, or the first session in April, we finished thinking, or we summarized it as thinking that, well, we believe that the aviation industry or air transport industry can come out stronger of this crisis than it was before. Now, my question to sort of the panel, or every panelist is, or maybe someone can comment, do you still believe this is true? And what can we do to really make it happen?
I don't remember that conclusion from the previous panel. I figured that we were going to be going through a real difficult time. We'll come out with a different industry. And I do think we will have an industry. I do think air transport is necessary, not just for the economy, but for social reasons as well. The question is, how do we get there? I am inclined to agree with Andrew in a lot, but not everything. But I do think the industry has to consolidate. I think the consolidation has to be throughout the ecosystem. I am more skeptical of his proposal for vertical consolidation, where essentially airlines take control of airports, which I think was kind of implied in some of the stuff that you'd written, Andrew. And government policy is an obstacle to achieving that. And we need to, I really liked Andrew's phrase of, we don't have any international airlines. We've got domestic airlines that fly to a few international places. I thought that was really astute. I'll stop there.
So Andrew, what do you think?
Sorry, the old curse of the mute. Let me just say to Mike very quickly that I don't think I believe in vertical integration or vertical consolidation entirely, but I do think that airlines and airports are going to have to change their relationship very strongly. I think historically the airport model was to attract as many airlines as possible. Going forward, the airport model will be to be as attractive as possible to one airline. And I think that changes the balance of the relationship. In answer to your question, Achim, I think, will the airline industry come out stronger? Not if it continues to do what it's doing at the moment, which is just pretending that we can get back to the past and we can preserve everything. And then next thing you know, we'll be able to just go on with no change. I think that way's foolish. Will we come out stronger? Yes, perhaps, if we are serious about making some really serious reforms.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we have to, I know there are a lot of other things to discuss right now, but we have to stop the session now because the time is over. So I want to thank the panelists for this extremely, in my opinion, insightful discussion. I want to thank the other participants from all over the world for the active participation in this session. Let's do our best to help handle this pandemic. And if you like this webinar series, then I would like to to become a GARS member. Actually, I was maybe Brian. Maybe is there something you would like to say in the last minute to us Because I just saw your face and I thought.
Well, only thank you for organising this series. And you know, I sort of share the sentiments of what we just heard from Mike and Andrew, that you know, this is a really important industry. I mean, I've always thought this is a really important industry for its wider economic benefits. I know it's a bit of a controversial thing amongst some of our GARS colleagues, but I think that you know, there's a fantastic opportunity to make radical reforms here. Ownership and control, I think, is one that you'll see. Certainly, we're looking at that. You know, we had a bit of a push on that a few years back, because I think consolidation is going to be key to success. But you know, we won't necessarily come out of this stronger unless we take a realistic and sensible way to doing this reorganisation.
Yeah, so thank you very much. I think this is a very a good final word. So we have to finish the session now. So thanks to everyone, the panelists and all the other participants for this excellent session. We have the session recorded. We will publish it online. We will distribute the link to you. And thanks again very much. And bye bye. So the session is over now. Bye bye.